Good evening. Welcome to Georgetown University in Qatar, and welcome to what really promises to be a very engaging conversation. Justice is rarely linear. It moves in fits and starts, often breaking down just when it seems within reach. The powerful convince themselves that it will never touch them. And too often they are right, until suddenly they are not. History shows that even presidents, generals, and the architects of mass violence can one day be forced to answer questions they believed unaskable. Tonight's discussion turns on one such moment. This week, the ICC charged former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte with crimes against humanity, alleging his role in at least 76 murders during the so-called war on drugs that left tens of thousands of poor Filipinos dead. The case now carries implications beyond Manila. It tests the credibility of global justice itself, and whether institutions built in the shadow of Nuremberg still command legitimacy in an age when authoritarianism is elected, even celebrated. There is a paradox here. The ICC has grown more ambitious, widening its docket beyond Africa, issuing warrants against Israeli leaders, and learning from the fractured transitions of war to peace in Colombia, Kenya, and Sudan. Yet it is also under siege from the very powers that claim to defend the Potemkin village we call the international order. The questions before us span the crises of our time. What does transitional justice mean when dynasties, stolen wealth, and impunity outlive the strongman? And what does accountability look like when disinformation corrodes truth and when law bends to power? At Georgetown University in Qatar, our role is to create space for precisely these conversations, where regional and global perspectives meet head-on in candid exchange. To help us navigate tonight's questions, we are honored to host Mr. Ruben Carranza, senior expert at the International Center for Transitional Justice. He will be introduced and joined in conversation by my colleague, Professor Noha Aboueldahab, for whom I am very grateful for all the work that she does in this area. Professor Aboueldahab is an assistant professor of international law and an award-winning specialist in transitional justice. She is the author of Transitional Justice and the Prosecution of Political Leaders in the Arab Region, with a forthcoming book on Arab diasporas and international law. Her work has appeared in leading journals and outlets, from the Journal of International Criminal Justice to Foreign Policy and Al Jazeera. Please join me in welcoming Professor Aboueldahab to the podium.
Thank you, Dean Masri, for the kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Ruben Carranza, senior expert at the International Center for Transitional Justice in New York. For many years, he has worked with countries emerging from conflict, authoritarian rule, or colonial occupation, including Myanmar, Libya, Palestine, South Sudan, Syria, and the Philippines. He has advised truth commissions in Kenya, Tunisia, Nepal, and Gambia. He supported reparations efforts in South Africa, Sierra Leone, Peru, and Iraq, and worked closely with the International Criminal Court, UN agencies, and justice officials in Ukraine, South Korea, and Australia. In the Philippines, Mr. Carranza helped recover $680 million in assets stolen by Ferdinand Marcos, and he drafted the reparations law for dictatorship victims, which benefited more than 11,000 survivors. He has also contributed to accountability debates in the US, testifying before California's task force on reparations for slavery and supporting similar efforts in New Jersey and Michigan. In addition to his practice, Mr. Carranza has taught at the University of the Philippines College of Law, and he's an adjunct faculty member at New York University. He holds law degrees from the University of the Philippines and NYU Law School. I first met Ruben in the summer of 2012 at his office in New York. I was already very, very familiar and had benefited greatly from his work and scholarship, and it was a real treat to interview him for my book research at the time. My first child was 9 months old back then, and as all mothers who struggle and juggle work and motherhood simultaneously, I was a little nervous leaving my baby with a friend for the duration of my visit to the International Center for Transitional Justice. But my daughter will forgive me now, I hope, because I had such a fantastic conversation with Ruben that for a little while there, my worries about her kind of disappeared. So my friend had taken my daughter to a nearby department store where she bought her a pair of bright pink Crocs. Not my taste, but of course, very sweet of her. And Maya, my daughter, seemed very happy with her new pair of shoes. I tell this little story because 13 years later now, when I hear the name Ruben Carranza, I associate it with both brilliant scholarship and practice in the field of transitional justice and with bright pink Crocs. I've had the pleasure of engaging with Ruben Carranza a few times since then, and I am so thrilled that we have finally managed to lure him here to Doha because I've been trying to do that for about a decade now. Today's event is called Duterte at the International Criminal Court, Global Implications. Ruben will be delivering remarks on this important issue for about 20 minutes or so, after which I will then moderate a discussion with him and then open it up for questions from the audience. I'd like to thank all the people who worked very hard to make this event happen. This includes Pia and Nala from Faculty Affairs, everyone at the Dean's Office, the International Politics Department, which has sponsored this event, the communications team, the events team, and of course, all the other staff involved. Thank you so much for all your efforts, particularly during this busy time at GUQ. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ruben Carranza.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for having me. Magandang gabi sa mga Pilipino na nandito. I'm very jet-lagged, but I made sure I would be awake for this, not only because I'm supposed to talk here, but also I wanted to listen. And Noha assured me that Filipinos in Qatar, I think there's 250,000. That's a lot. Possibly have diverse views, which is to be charitable about it, about Rodrigo Duterte and possibly also Ferdinand Marcos Jr., both of whom have either cursed me or sued me. But I have slides and I will not probably present all of them so that we have more time to discuss, but I'll try to do my best. At the end of this slides, I'll show you a website, but not yet. I think this happened, I don't know, recently. I don't know if some of you are here, were there or not, but it would be exciting to find out if you were. But Georgetown first. This is not the first time I'm talking in a Georgetown University. In Georgetown University, I should say. Yeah, that's in Washington, D.C. Sometime in the middle of the pandemic or right after, I was asked to participate in a conference in Georgetown that ICTJ, where I work, co-organized. It was a consortium of about 10 American universities, University of Michigan, Georgetown, a couple of smaller colleges, and they were funded to do two things. Do research on reparations for descendants of slaves and slavery in general, and then find out if the communities they were in, where they had campuses, were involved in slavery or could do something for the descendants of slaves. And that's why Georgetown hosted the event. In Georgetown, one of our speakers was a descendant of a slave. And she availed of one of the forms of reparation that Georgetown University and the Society of Jesuits had offered. What that form of reparation is admission into Georgetown. And so this grandmother of, I don't know how old she was at that point, became a college student in Georgetown generations after her ascendants had been enslaved, and such as this family, sold by Georgetown, sold by the Jesuits at that time who controlled Georgetown. 272 slaves owned by Georgetown were sold so that they could establish what was then Georgetown College. So it's possible to commit injustice. Perhaps at that time it's committed, it was seen as not important, the way slaves were seen as property, the way even Jesuit priests thought slaves were property. But it's also possible to repair, to atone, to seek forgiveness, to acknowledge and to do justice. And so that's something to keep in mind when we talk about justice, transitional justice, criminal justice. I work in the field of transitional justice, and every year ICTJ, almost every year, publishes this small article I wrote. It refers to International Criminal Justice Day, the day the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was established. And my article says it's wrong. Not because it's not International Criminal Justice Day, but because a lot of organizations, including at some point, the civil society organization called the ICC Coalition, the coalition for the ICC, they called the day International Justice Day. And I said it's wrong because it's not international justice, it's international criminal justice. I'm not being annoying here. There's a very important distinction between prosecution and punishment as justice and all other forms of justice that you can do, not only when prosecution is impossible. For example, you can't prosecute the enslavers of those 272 slaves that Georgetown acquired, sold, and profited from. But you can atone, you can repair. So reparations is one form of justice. So is truth-seeking. Georgetown, in fact, supported a Truth and Reconciliation Foundation for descendants of slaves. So that's an important distinction to make. We can discuss that during the Q&A. So that's a definition of transitional justice that appears on the ICTJ website. Judicial and non-judicial tools for justice and accountability in post-conflict, post-authoritarian, as well as in countries dealing with unresolved historical injustices. For example, occupation, or occupation accompanied now by genocide. Some of the work we do includes establishing truth commissions, prosecutions, litigation, reparations, and all the others there. And since I work on reparations for ICTJ, I mentioned this morning when I had another discussion that I worked in the Central African Republic, where an ICC case against former Vice President of the Democratic Republic of Congo was pending when the ICC asked me to be an expert to recommend reparations in that case against Jean-Pierre Bemba. I don't have time to talk about the whole case, but what's important is that I recommended some forms of reparation for over 5,000 victims of Jean-Pierre Bemba's war crimes, crimes against humanity in the Central African Republic, including rape, murder, and pillage. And the ICC The judges took the recommendations only for Jean-Pierre Bemba to be acquitted later. So, Duterte's drug war was a class war. It wasn't a war on drugs. You don't wage war against pharmaceuticals, right? If you were waging a war on drugs, you'd go after the drugs. Maybe you could go after actual large-scale drug dealers or actual large-scale drug manufacturers of narcotics. But he went after poor people, and he admitted that himself. He went after what he claimed were drug addicts, drug users, small-time dealers, killed them, had them killed, and as yesterday's charges at the ICC articulated, committed a scale of murder that reached the level of crimes against humanity. By definition, 2 or more people are killed in a widespread and systematic way, and these people are civilians. That's why it's not a war crime, but it's a crime against humanity. Some estimates put the number of those killed in the drug war of Rodrigo Duterte at conservatively 5,000, maybe 6,000. Who said that? The Philippine National Police. So, that's the official number. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Journalism Consortia put the number at perhaps 30,000. That's the number of people actually disappeared in Argentina during the military dictatorship there. But it took them years, a decade almost. Duterte, 6 years. He called it Oplan Tokhang. And I grew up in the city of Cebu in the Philippines, so I speak Visaya. So Tokhang in Visaya, which is also what Duterte speaks, it's an acronym for Tok Tok Hangyo. And so those who know that means it's knock, Tok Tok, Hangyo, beg. So where did he get the idea of Tokhang? From Richard Nixon. Knock and plead. Richard Nixon's drug war started with asking police in urban areas in the United States to knock at the doors of people they suspected to be drug users or drug dealers and supposedly plead with them to stop. What happens when you did not stop? That's when Richard Nixon launched an all-out war on drugs, which consisted mostly of arresting, not killing drug dealers. But that's where the war on drugs came from. Not an indigenous, I hate drugs type of argument from Duterte, or something from Thailand where a former president also waged his war on drugs, or even in Latin America or Central America where you have Mexico, or Latin America and Colombia, but from the United States. It's a US import, the war on drugs. You cannot have knock and plead in the Philippines. Some houses don't even have doors. So even from that perspective of, let's do this kind of drug war, you couldn't have done that kind of drug war, and he knew it. He knew that when he started his drug war, it would be a war on the poor and a murderous drug war. That's who he murdered. They lived in that hut, in that shack. Tricycle driver, his motorized three-wheeler, or even, I don't think it was even motorized in his case, found his body in the middle of the road. They lived there, in that shack. This is not a large-scale drug dealer who imports whatever chemicals, synthesizes them into drugs, and then sells them to several pushers. This is someone Duterte said was a drug user. We don't even know that. We don't know that because he was never arrested, charged, prosecuted, and convicted. And even if he was convicted, it would be 6 years to 12 years maximum sentence. because there's no death penalty in the Philippines. Capital punishment has been suspended. It's in the Constitution for removal, but they could restore it. They have not. And yet Filipinos supported the drug war. Many reasons. I won't go into the sociology of it, but middle-class security, people felt threatened, blamed addicts. Why? Because Duterte, and even before Duterte, Joseph Estrada, a former president, said the same thing. The myth of safety in Duterte's home city of Davao, the nostalgia for strongmen, for a Marcos, but now known as Duterte. And of course, social media. By the end of Duterte's term, it was now obvious that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was going to run as president. He ran as president and then teamed up with Duterte's daughter, Sara. They won. And I wrote this article, and it was not very hard for me to come up with a title. And also a title that was a pun. So pun was intended here. When he was while he was campaigning, when he was elected, and up to about, let's just say, up to about February this year, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. did not ever say anything against Duterte's drug war. Nothing. At most, he said, maybe we could have tried something else. But he did not say those were crimes. He did not say those were extrajudicial killings. He did not say people behind this should be prosecuted. Nothing. So the reason he's now the reason he had Duterte arrested by the ICC, detained, was because of the rivalry between the Duterte and Marcos families. In other words, not for accountability, not for justice, not for the truth about those who were killed, but so that the Marcos family will eliminate a rival political dynasty. That's the reason for Duterte's arrest. Just as a footnote, does it invalidate a warrant of arrest at the ICC or make Duterte's detention unlawful? No. It has no, well, of course, unless you ask Duterte's counsel, who claims Duterte was kidnapped. And he actually argues that in court. Duterte's daughter says the same thing, kidnapped, right? So I think they belatedly filed kidnapping charges in the Philippines because they never thought about it. If he was kidnapped, why did they not ever file a criminal case for kidnapping in the Philippines? But anyway, it was, a quid pro quo when they did this. I'll skip this part. Marcos thanks Duterte for burying his father as a hero. And then Marcos starts defending Duterte before February 25. Duterte withdrew the Philippines from the ICC in 2018. That withdrawal took effect in 2019. When Marcos became president in 2022, the Philippines was no longer part of the ICC. Why the Philippines became part of the ICC effective 2011, when the Philippines Senate ratified the treaty that created the ICC. Who was a senator at that time? Did he sign and ratify? Yes. His signature appears there. I'll skip the technical side of what happened, except this one highlighted in yellow. Marcos, as president, also asked the ICC to defer its investigation of Rodrigo Duterte. The ICC had already opened a preliminary examination, and then it could have proceeded to an investigation, but a state that is a party to the ICC, even a state that is not a party to the ICC, could ask for a deferment. That's what Marcos did. So to ask for a deferment at the ICC, you have to have lawyers. Oh, let me skip. Sorry. Oh, how do I go back? Here. So you have to have lawyers, and I'll mention who the lawyers were later who helped Marcos Jr. ask for a deferment. So finally, in February 2025, to cut a long and not really complex story short, Marcos, cooperating with the ICC, had Duterte arrested and brought to The Hague and in detention. So This is a protest at The Hague. I was going to use this slide as the global implications of Duterte's case at the ICC, but Netanyahu has a warrant of arrest, Putin has a warrant of arrest, potentially the leader of the junta in Myanmar might have a warrant of arrest issued, leaders of the Taliban have a warrant of arrest issued against them, but none of those warrants of arrest have been enforced except here, and only because Marcos Jr. effectively surrendered Duterte to the court. But there are global implications outside of those that I just mentioned about other leaders. For example, and this is now going on, when Donald Trump ordered the bombing of Venezuelan boats, right? How many times now? 3 times. Killing perhaps 15, 20 people. It's hard to know. It's hard to know because there's no video or footage or anything that shows that they were actually transporting drugs or in fact that they were Venezuelans. It's just his say-so. But he's now justifying it on 2 grounds. He says this is his war on drugs, and he says he now wants drug dealers to be classified as terrorists. So now you have 2 wars overlapping waged by Donald Trump. A war on drugs and a war on terror, both of which have happened in other countries. The other implication is that war on drugs are also going on elsewhere in the world. In Mexico, it is still going on in some places. In Thailand, it goes on and off. In Cambodia as well. But here, as an example, Donald Trump declassified Colombia as a country that has cooperated in the U.S. war on drugs. Why? Because Gustavo Petro dared defy Donald Trump. And so now, the U.S. government is saying that Colombia is back into allowing those who plant illicit crops to continue with what they're doing. So, global implications, and very quickly. The case against Duterte opens a discussion on accountability of states and businesses that enabled drug war killings. The case against Duterte, because he is now a defendant who is not African or Arab, is an opportunity to counter criticism that the ICC has been focusing disproportionately on Arabs and Africans. Of the 33 cases that are pending at the ICC where you have pre-trial or trial, only Duterte is not Arab or African. And so there's some basis for that criticism, but this case now says, well, we're not just targeting Arabs or Africans. But another implication is that the ICC case against Duterte challenges Trump's effort to sanction the ICC. It's proceeding despite difficulty. Now it's a deputy prosecutor that's supervising the case against the ICC because there's a separate investigation against Karim Khan for sexual harassment, and so he had to step down from this case. But they've sanctioned the deputy prosecutors as well, the 2 deputy prosecutors, as well as the judges of the ICC who are involved in the Netanyahu Gallant case there. Another implication is that the warrants of arrest issued by the ICC can be used to leverage and ask states to fulfill their responsibility under the Rome Treaty. An example of that, and it may or may not be a good example depending on your perspective, Macron, French leader, actually announced that France might not enforce the ICC warrant against Netanyahu. And one theory is that it was his way to try to compel Israel to negotiate with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Right? We will not do this if you do that. Now, good or bad, it's a way of leveraging the warrants. But then there's also the issue of moral and ethical issues outside of the legal issues at the ICC in litigating crimes, including genocide. And so I'll skip this. A reminder of the enablers of the drug war, which I said is one of the implications. Duterte actually said that he would be the Filipino Hitler, and that he would kill the same number of people. He said 30 million died in the Holocaust. So he said, the same number of people would be killed, or 3 million died in the Holocaust, and that he would kill the same number of people in his drug war. Having said that, Benjamin Netanyahu then invited Duterte to a state visit to Israel, where he took him to the Holocaust Memorial, and they both said never again. There you go. Another Duterte claim is that the ICC is a colonial court. White people dominate the ICC. And so there's a picture of the judges at the ICC. Okay, I discussed this already. Now, the ethical question, and I'll make this quick, Noha, and I'm going to round up soon. When I said Marcos asked for a deferment of the investigation in 2023, he had to have a lawyer representing the Philippines officially at the ICC. His lawyer was Sarah Bafadel, who works for a law firm in London called 9BR, 9 Bedford Row. Sarah Bafadel drafted the Philippines position. It was rejected by the ICC. The investigation moved forward. Moving quickly, when Duterte hired a lawyer, one of his lawyers, and I'll talk about him right after this, is Nicholas Kaufman. But Nicholas Kaufman wanted a specialist on jurisdictional questions at the ICC, someone who had written about it. And everyone knows that Dov Jacobs had written about it. So Nicholas Kaufman asked Dov Jacobs to be his co-counsel. Where does Dov Jacobs work? He works for 9BR, 9 Bedford Road, the same law firm that Marcos had hired to try to get Duterte out of the investigation initially. So now, who is representing whom in this case? Nobody raises this question, although Kaufman has asked for the exclusion of Karim Khan, supposedly because Karim Khan met with victims in the Philippines before he became prosecutor. So now, that's Nicholas Kaufman asking that the prosecutor be removed because he had represented victims. That's a pending question at the ICC. That's also, so this is a scoop from the Middle East Monitor. I had a call in New York at about 2 in the morning, 2 p.m. in Manila, and it was a Filipino reporter asking me to comment on this scoop. She said that this scoop had found out that Netanyahu's legal advisor had sent a message to Karim Khan, telling Karim Khan to drop the Netanyahu case or the court, to quote, will be destroyed. Who was the messenger? Nicholas Kaufman, the lawyer of Rodrigo Duterte, who worked for the IDF, even helped draft a memo for the IDF on how to evade universal jurisdiction if you're vacationing in other countries. So Nicholas Kaufman also had this strange interview in a South African TV channel many years ago, where he claimed that he was also a lawyer for Imelda Marcos. Maybe if I ever meet him, I'll ask him when did this happen, because I've had a lot of Marcos cases, but I've never heard of him do that. And now Nicholas Kaufman wants the trial to be indefinitely suspended because he claims Duterte is unfit to stand trial. Duterte turned 81 recently, and that's why some of you, or maybe none of you, were at that celebration here. Duterte is now the oldest defendant. Netanyahu is 75, Putin is 72, Mohammed al-Bashir, Omar al-Bashir is 80, so Duterte is 81. But his daughter also says that they talk about a lot of things and he remembers many things. And she just said that maybe a few days ago, so who knows, right? I'll skip this. So applying transitional justice to a drug war, Mexico has had a truth commission to deal with disappearances in the Mexican drug war under the new president. And they also announced an amnesty for low-level drug dealers in Mexico. In the Philippines, you have had this type of convenings organized by civil society, this one by an author who wrote about the Duterte drug war, where they invite family members and survivors of the drug war to talk in the open, an unofficial truth commission, in effect. This father of a very young boy had asked that the death certificate of his child be amended. His child was killed in the drug war, but the death certificate says his child died of pneumonia. And so he sought to have the death certificate changed. It took 9 years, but that's a form of reparation. Changing the cause of death, telling the truth about what happened. This is a reparations program in the Philippines that I helped design. And so it's possible to have a reparations program for victims of the drug war as well. This is a memorial in the Philippines for victims of the Marcos dictatorship. It's possible to remember victims of the drug war as well. But there are no memorials for victims of the drug war. There's a cafe funded by an NGO that employs family members, survivors of the drug war. And then there's a website that I want you to, if you can, check out on your phones. It's paalam.org. And when it opens, there's a search bar on the left. And if you type Skylar, I'll type that. Okay, this is in Arabic, so I cannot. Can you help me type it? If you can, type Skylar, S-K-Y-L-E-R. So these are the names, some pictures of those killed in the drug war. It's unofficial. It's and can you click his name? It's one of those who died. You can click his name, yeah. That's Skylar. He's from Cebu, 4-year-old child, killed in the drug war. So can you bring him back to life? Even if you could proceed with the trial of Rodrigo Duterte, have him sentenced, that's not going to bring back the life of a 4-year-old. Even if you convicted Duterte to, ICC also doesn't even have life imprisonment. It's a limited number of years. There are things that prosecutions and punishment can do, but sometimes they fall short of justice. So let me stop there. Here?
Yes. Thank you, Ruben. Wow, what a fascinating set of remarks. You really have a way of sort of weaving things that I don't think we would normally connect so easily, like transitional justice, international law, the ICC, Netanyahu, the lawyers, Duterte, Marcos, and the humans that get caught up in all of this. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it to the audience for questions. Since we are where we are now with the ICC and the confirmation, well, the charges that the prosecutors confirmed yesterday, what would you say has been the most notable impact of the Duterte trial so far at the ICC on Filipino society, Filipino politics, and the Filipino diaspora?
In the Philippines, I think that having Duterte held in ICC detention shows the possibility of impunity being defeated. That you can actually defeat impunity. For a country like the Philippines, has seen one dictator, at least two corrupt presidents sent to jail only to be released. And then another president who kills 30,000 people and never faced consequences. And then finally, a dictator's son coming back to power. Impunity was thought of as a way of life. That's just how it is in the Philippines and perhaps in many other countries. But having someone detained in another court where you can't really say that it's controlled by any political group or family in the Philippines, that's important. But for the diaspora, it might be different. And that's why we come back to, for example, here or in the region and elsewhere in the world, where you have, and I will say this, and I could be very wrong, where you have middle class and lower middle class families not finding jobs in the Philippines, forced to do work abroad, and sending remittances back to their hometowns, and hoping that that money will not be dissipated, that will not be wasted on corruption, for example. And so some of them will support a drug war killing, child murdering president who promises that the money you send back to the Philippines will not be wasted. And that's how you get people to believe that killing helps you, that killing is good for you, that killing is a way of life, impunity coming back. So it's hard to say whether it's completely good, because some of it may lead to a backlash. When Sara Duterte runs for president in 2028, that's for sure, that backlash could be felt.
And I mean, as you mentioned earlier, there are at least 250,000 Filipinos here in Qatar, and the Filipino diaspora in general is huge in other countries as well. So could you perhaps expand a little bit on the role, if any, of these Filipino diasporas in shaping the conversations about justice in the Philippines, and especially now with the Duterte case?
So there was a mother, and I can't remember what country she works in the Gulf, whose son was murdered in the drug war, and she went home for the funeral. And I don't know what went through her mind then. But you shouldn't have to have family members killed while you're working in the Gulf to realize that there is something wrong with this. But that's the difficulty. The diaspora relies a lot on social media for news. The diaspora relies a lot on the internet for understanding what's going on in the Philippines. But when you have YouTube and Facebook and TikTok dominated by disinformation networks, either funded by Marcos or by Duterte, it's difficult to counter that. I talk about truth commissions, for example, but what can one truth commission do, or what can one website do to all the dozens of TikToks or hundreds of TikToks that you see say, this guy is an addict, he deserved to be killed, or Sara Duterte will save us from Marcos Jr., when in fact, neither Marcos Jr. or Sara Duterte will save you. They will just pull you down further. And
And if this Duterte case doesn't proceed for whatever reason, or he's even found not guilty, what sort of impact do you think this would have both on the ICC and on Filipino society?
When Duterte's Filipino lawyer, the first time, because there was a proceeding that many of you saw, Duterte was attending remotely. His lawyer was his executive secretary, can't remember his name, Midyaldea, now you remind me. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that this case is just being used by the ICC to bolster its institutional reputation because there are no other cases pending at the ICC. And what he said is partly true. The ICC has been suffering because of lack of funding and because of the lack of enforcement of the warrants of arrest of those whose cases should proceed if they were ever arrested. Putin, Netanyahu, Omar al-Bashir, and so many other people. That's why you have Africans and Arabs who are at the low level, who are the ones who face trials. But at the same time, it's not true. the ICC wasn't meant to try many people. The ICC was meant to try persons most responsible at the highest levels, except that at the beginning, this really didn't happen. Luis Moreno Ocampo, the first prosecutor, prosecuted this small-time warlord from the DRC, whose only asset was a Volkswagen van, and whose crime was recruiting child soldiers, whose families actually volunteered their children to him. And he was convicted of that. That was one of the first cases where I submitted an amicus brief for ICTJ. So this case is important for the ICC because it's meant to show what the ICC should be doing, in fact, trying the persons most responsible for the worst crimes in the Rome Statute.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And
one more thing to add, because you asked the impact if he were acquitted or for whatever reason the case doesn't proceed. You know, I remember a case in 1991, if I'm not mistaken. Imelda Marcos was charged with racketeering in New York. And the jury, this was not 1991, this was probably, around that time. The jury, all-American jury, were asked to convict Imelda Marcos and Ferdinand Marcos, except that in the middle of the trial, Ferdinand Marcos dies. And the evidence that had been assembled was against Ferdinand, the dictator, not against the wife. She was just co-accused. The jury acquitted Imelda. Imelda came out of the courtroom and said, "I have been acquitted by the greatest legal system in the world." The prosecutor, by the way, of that case, Rudy Giuliani. So there are characters, but that's the problem, right? When a American court or when a court in The Hague says this person is innocent or we cannot try him, it isn't just about that person. It's about, a judgment that will face the society in which these people come from and will hound them for a longer time.
It's so many characters. When is your novel coming out? There's so many interesting
I need
characters.
a publisher.
Okay. In fact, since you mentioned Imelda Marcos, I just have to share with everyone here. I mean, I think that Ruben has the best profile on X, and I'm going to quote it, with your permission. Sure. I mean, it is public. Sued by Imelda Marcos for calling her husband a thief and dictator, said, "Sorry, corrected myself, and said her husband is a dead thief and dictator." Don't want to be on your bad side.
Yeah, she sued me, and so I had to, after a press conference in the commission I worked in, going after them, and we had won the case. $680 million came back to the Philippines because we had won that case that I helped litigate at the Philippine Supreme Court. So I said, this shows, salamat po. So I said, this shows that Marcos was a thief. And so she sued me 2 days later. So I hold another press conference, and that's where I corrected myself.
Okay, well, I'm glad you did. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll turn it to the audience. Since these issues concerning international criminal justice, the ICC, leaders and former leaders with arrest warrants from the ICC, for a lot of us, of course, Palestine is also on our mind. And if I understood correctly, the Philippines has recognized Palestinian statehood since 1989. Mm-hmm. And then most recently, we've had Canada, the UK, France, and Australia, and others also recognize the state of Palestine. Some of them conditional, some of them less conditional. Let's put it that way. So, do you think is it okay? So there are two parts to this question. Is it too soon to assess the impact of such state recognition on Palestinians on the ground and internationally? But also, how does the Philippines' recognition of Palestine since 1989 play out today?
Even during the Marcos dictatorship, Marcos wanted to recognize a lot of countries to pretend that he was independent of the United States in his foreign policy. That's the reason why initially Palestine, was able to cultivate relations with the Philippines. But more importantly, I think, is that Marcos was also afraid of the Gulf countries withholding oil from the Philippines. So a lot of it is economic, a lot of it was dictatorship related, but none of it was really about supporting Palestinian liberation. Marcos was afraid as well of a secessionist movement in the Philippines that wanted to establish the Bangsa Moro, a Muslim country, a Moro indigenous Muslim country in the Philippines. And so that was the push and pull of the Palestinian position in the Philippines, and it has gone on for long. But I think that now the Philippine government is at a crossroads because you're neighbors with Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei. These are countries that have refused to even recognize Israel, and let alone cultivate relations with it. And you have the Philippines that officially recognizes Palestine, but has not really acted beyond anything like that. I think one implication here is, and you saw that picture, right, of collect them all. You got to catch them all. Duterte, Netanyahu, Putin. I think it's important for the ICC and for those who want to support accountability for the worst possible crimes in the world, not only to support the prosecution of Rodrigo Duterte, but to insist that the countries that are backing the ICC, European Union countries, Australia, Japan is one of the few Asian countries that is a member of the ICC, that they do the same thing for arresting Benjamin Netanyahu, who, by the way, is, I think, going to the United States again this week, and will have to draw a flight path that is now even longer and more complicated than ever because of the warrant of arrest. He can be arrested. It's the political will to do that has to be drawn up.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Okay. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. I think we have microphones around. I think I'll take 2, maybe 3 questions at a time. If you could very briefly introduce yourself, that would be nice. And it would be great if you could keep your questions concise. Anybody? All right. Okay, so here in the second row wearing a red shirt, and then we'll go to the striped shirt in the following row. So second row first. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Carranza, for that very insightful conversation. I'm a freshman as well, so I just wanted to ask, with the recent rallies in the Philippines, what do you think is the implications about how the Filipinos would see political dynasties? But do you think that Filipinos would be more open to changing their opinions about political dynasties, or do you still think that a lot of Filipinos would still be close-minded?
Thank you. And we'll take, yes, right behind striped shirt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carranza. I'm Lawrence. I'm a senior majoring in culture and politics. So my question is regarding, you've mentioned earlier about the strongman nostalgia. And I think this is a big thing in Filipino culture because I think it's almost a lot of it is rooted there, like in terms of voters' perception. And even right now, like with Duterte's case, I've seen like a lot of posts in Instagram saying like "run for Duterte" or free Duterte, or even to some extent even nationalizing it to like free the Philippines. So or like pray for the Philippines. And sadly, even part of the Filipino the Filipino diaspora here in Qatar organized one of those events, which is also very ridiculous and at the same time disheartening, seeing that like there are actually a lot of supporters even here. Especially, of course, you mentioned social media as well. So I was just, my question is really just asking, like, what are the implications of this to our political future, and especially to also prevent electing people like Duterte and Marcos at the same time?
Thank you. Do you want to take one more, or you want to respond?
Maybe I'll respond to that first.
Sure.
The Philippines Constitution prohibits dynasties, but the same Philippine constitutional provision that says, we don't like dynasties also says Congress will pass a law to implement this. Congress consists of political dynasties. So now, it's clear. The solution to this problem isn't in the Constitution, isn't in the law. And I think it's important to also consider the fact that it's possible you might have to rely on dynasties to outlaw dynasties. In the same way that right now, whether we like it or not, it's Ferdinand Marcos Jr. who sent Rodrigo Duterte to the ICC. It's Ferdinand Marcos Jr. who's trying to open up a discussion around corruption, which is strange because Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is still benefiting from $5 billion in ill-gotten wealth and hasn't paid the taxes due on that wealth. You have to live in a world of contradictions. You have to live in a world where the dialectics of transitions happens. One contradiction after another, and you find out how you can move from there. Those who were students here and perhaps those who work here may or may not have seen what happened during the Arab Spring 10 years ago. Protests and revolutions in Tunisia, where I have worked, in Egypt, where Abdel al-Fattah was recently released, thank God.
Yeah.
Or in Syria, in Libya, where I also do work. Those revolutions were driven by unemployment, corruption, sometimes by political repression, but far less than that, but by the grievances of ordinary people who were not activists, who were just suffering too much and decided, I will go out and protest. Those people have become older. Many of them have had families. Many of them are probably also politicians. And you have seen what has happened to the Arab Spring. Some of it has descended into warfare, into armed conflict. And a lot of it hasn't changed the way the Arab Spring societies are still run. But now you also see a string of protests. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Nepal, and you have the one-piece flag flying. A generation that did not see the Arab Spring. So where did they get this idea that you could go out into the streets and start burning the parliament in Nepal, where I did a lot of work for many years, where there was a truth commission, in fact, where there is a peace agreement, where transitional justice was formally adopted but never worked. So there is a new generation of people for which this vocabulary of accountability and prosecution and law doesn't have any value, or at least doesn't have any immediate use for them, and that perhaps the anger is just too much, that the solution is to go out and burn the place down. And whether or not that's how to solve problems is not for me to judge, but it's for me to observe.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another round of questions. Okay, red and white shirt, and then Maine, I'll come to you, I promise. And then, is it okay if we take three questions this time? And then in the light blue shirt, thanks.
Okay, so you mentioned that impunity in the Philippines would be decreased through the ICC case as of today, or at least if it would be continued. But wouldn't that still be somewhat difficult to fully achieve, given that without stronger international intervention, which is something that we usually rely on in the Philippines to actually take action in cases of corruption, wouldn't that be difficult to achieve because of the deeply rooted corruption that's present in the Philippines, as well as the entrenched political dynasties as mentioned earlier in the country?
Okay, thank you. Maine, you want to put your hand up?
Thank you so much for this wonderful event, Professor Noha and Attorney Ruben Carranza. I'm Maine, and I'm an international politics junior, and recently I've had a chance to visit the Bantayog ng Mga Bayani, which is the memorial for the victims of martial law. And one thing that I've noticed as I explored the place was that it's clearly underfunded and it's very much not well maintained at all, with walls crumbling down and ceilings that are broken and everything. My question is, how do we ensure that these kinds of places that are places that are supposed to promote the truth about martial law or other, for example, for conflicts when it comes to trying to achieve justice is maintained, or at least is known by the public. Because when I went there, I talked to some Filipinos as well that have been staying around Quezon City, and when I mentioned Bantayog ng mga bayani, they asked me, what is that? So I guess my question is, how do we ensure that we spread awareness about this pursuit of justice in other ways?
Thank you.
Magandang gabi po, Attorney Carranza, and good evening, Professor Noha. Thank you so much for your lecture, your speech, your talk about Duterte and the ICC. I have a very direct question. Maybe it's obvious, but to me, I don't know. In terms of transitional justice, how does the Filipino diaspora participate? And if we take the question even further than that, do you even view the Filipino diaspora as a key stakeholder in helping with transitional justice? And then I guess you could direct your message, your inspirational message towards students at Georgetown, students even in Qatar. How do we participate when we know that right now the action is mostly being done by civil society and we can't directly interact with civil society? Thank you.
Thank you.
So on corruption and what it takes, and I'm not sure that I got the question completely, but when I was at the commission that went after the Marcos family, I was invited by the United Nations to be a member of the technical committee that at that point drafted the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC. It was difficult because I had to work with bureaucrats from the Philippine government who loved going to Vienna, but not much else. So I did the work of helping draft that, and so when it was finally adopted as a treaty a couple of years later, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption has a chapter 5, that is entitled Asset Recovery. And there are provisions there that I remember battling over with diplomats from Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Belgium on the question of whether it's a state obligation to return ill-gotten assets. And so reached a compromise. It says it's the responsibility of recipient states, the states that recover assets, which is that received ill-gotten assets, which is a euphemism, like they didn't receive it. Their banks accepted it, skipped know your client rules, and continued to profit from it. But anyway, as a compromise, it's their obligation to return and provide reparations for that. And in a way, there is an international legal provision that deals with the consequences of corruption. But preventing corruption, or even defining corruption, that convention, we took weeks, because we had several sessions over 2 years. We took weeks to debate the definition of corruption. If you look at the convention today, there is no definition of corruption. Nothing. There was even a proposal to cover private sector corruption, corruption within companies or offices, for example. There were 2 countries that opposed it, among others. The United States opposed it. The other country that opposed it was China. So you can see here that there is some resistance even then and up to now over an international regime to deal with accountability for corruption. On the question of memorialization, when we recovered the 680 million, I had to make sure that it wasn't going to be lost again. The president was Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who, as you know, supported Ferdinand Marcos and Sara Duterte later. So what I did was to draft a law, which, as I mentioned earlier, became the reparations law. But In the same law, I inserted a provision that said, aside from, one provision of the law says $200 million will be set aside for compensation and other forms of reparation to victims of the dictatorship. That's how the reparations board was created in the Philippines, and that's how they ended up acknowledging officially 11,103 victims receiving compensation acknowledgement. But separately, I included a provision that allocated $10 million for a martial law museum, and that provision is still there. And that's why there's a separate agency in the Philippines called the Memorialization Commission. And that's an agency that will officially act on memorialization under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., of all ironies. The diaspora. ICTJ works in several countries, and one of them, we used to work in Liberia, where they had a Truth Commission to deal with the 14-year civil war and Charles Taylor and other atrocities. There is a significant Liberian diaspora in the United States, specifically in Minnesota. So the Liberia Truth Commission actually held public hearings in Minnesota. I had to go because we were helping them set it up. Much later, the Colombia Transitional Justice Process also had public hearings to a Truth Commission. They also tried to collect evidence from people who were affected by the armed conflict in Colombia, and they organized hearings with the Colombian diaspora in Boston, in France. Official transitional justice processes have dealt with diasporas in many parts of the world. One last example that I think is very, very helpful. When the Cambodia Khmer Rouge Tribunal was created by the United Nations, the United Nations did not include a reparations provision in the original charter of the Khmer Rouge Court. It was a group of diaspora Cambodian lawyers in Paris who wanted to propose that, but they wanted help. So they went to ICTJ, and I helped them draft a provision that is now part of the Cambodia Khmer Rouge Tribunal's charter. So the diaspora specialization, the fact that you actually exist in a space in a way insulated by the politics of your country, and the fact that you may have some degree of economic independence that allows you to actually do something about it and not just commute home too tired to deal with the politics of your country, I think that makes a difference.
Thank you. Okay, another round of questions. All right. In the white over here, and then glasses, yes, over here, and then wearing the black there in the back.
Should I stand up?
Yes, please, that would be great. And if you could speak loudly. Yes.
Okay, this is related to my question. Okay, there's this old anime called Revolutionary Girl Utena. This is related, but this show, it circles around the idea whether or not revolution can be brought upon by destroying a system completely, or if revolution can be brought upon through reform and progressive and eternal change. So my question is, would a full-scale destructive revolution or would progressive reform be the thing to change the deeply rooted system of dynasties in the Philippines? Which direction would the Philippines be likely to head into? Would it be full-scale revolution like Nepal, or something more eternal like what you previously said about dynasties destroying dynasties?
Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay. Hi, good evening. My name is Amina. I am a journalism junior at Northwestern. First of all, thank you so much for this insightful presentation. I found your discussion on transitional justice, particularly like the balance between prosecution and alternative like justice mechanisms, very, very enlightening. I've done a paper similar on this, so it was more interesting. My question is that you highlighted the importance of truth commissions and memorialization alongside prosecution. So in the Philippines context, what strategies would like the civil society organizations find most effective in reaching the affected communities? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, right there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It was really, really insightful. My question is similar to what has already been asked by the two ladies, but it relates to how criminals, quote-unquote leaders like Duterte, don't just commit these atrocities alone. They have bureaucracy, they have public supporting them. How do we deal with the complicity of the bureaucracy as well as the public that supports them? And is there a way for transitional justice, or is there a mechanism in international law where we can have a society where the supporters can reconcile with the victims? Or is there a way to sort of hold them accountable without ostracizing them, if that's the question?
Thank you.
Right, let me take it in reverse.
In reverse, okay.
Because I need to think about anime. From a criminal justice perspective, there is no crime, and I could be wrong, there is no crime called incitement to crimes against humanity. Neither incitement to war crimes. Incitement is difficult in itself. There's incitement to genocide, and that's a crime. And yes, it should be. There are efforts to actually try to define an incitement to war crimes, incitement to crimes against humanity type of, but not in the Rome Treaty. Which is why some of the incitement convictions of supporters, of people who egged on war criminals, are all about genocide, whether they were acquitted or convicted. Serbia, Croatia, there were acquittals on that question. In Rwanda, you had convictions for incitement to genocide. A radio commentator, a newspaper journalist. But you could also open up a slippery slope here when you want to hold those who supported crimes against humanity accountable. I know Filipinos who want accountability for Duterte also want accountability for influencers on social media who egged on the killings, justified them on social media. And Filipinos argued on social media over these questions of stop trying to justify and trying to encourage killings, while on the other hand you had Filipinos saying, but my family was a victim of drug addicts, they were raped, killed, they deserved to be killed. And so these arguments went on and sometimes spilled over outside of social media, outside, offices, homes, neighborhoods. Nobody ever asked, why not hold social media accountable? Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. Facebook actually came up a few years ago with a human rights report on the Philippines. You should read it. And they acknowledged that a large part of what was happening in the Philippines was happening through social media, because of social media. There's a human rights unit on Facebook. This is not Chatham House, so I can't go any further than that. But one of the head of that unit is a very good friend of mine who used to work at ICTJ.
All right. Everyone's on their phones now.
Yes, and she's facing a lot of problems around accountability for Facebook. But when I put that up earlier and said corporations who enabled crimes against humanity, the drug war, I was referring to social media corporations. And so I think it's important to identify a hierarchy of enabling. Right? Where should you start so that your efforts, that's the reason why the ICC was created, right? The person's most responsible. You will see in the charging document that there are potentially eight other names that were redacted from the charging document. Who are these 8 people? Do you think that the person who shot Skyler Abatayo will be one of them? Probably not. What will the family of Skyler say? Will they be satisfied? They will not be satisfied. You have to make decisions, and some of these decisions are very, very difficult. That's why the ICC is there. But you also could have truth commissions. You also could have local prosecutions, and that can happen in a transitional justice process. Will it ever happen in the Philippines? It's hard to say. We never had a truth commission for the Marcos dictatorship. there was a separate truth commission that went after their assets, and that was the PCGG where I worked. I tried my best to do that work, not just as a forensic, accounting, legal type of work, but as work that could discuss the root causes of the dictatorship's corruption. And so maybe that possibility is still there. What was the other question again?
The anime.
There was another.
There was another one.
Okay. Right, so I mentioned the Memorialization Commission for the Marcos dictatorship. There is no corresponding parallel effort for drug war victims. And so far, I've spoken to some of the priests that have supported families. I've spoken to one of the lawyers of the victims, is a classmate of mine from law school, although one of the lawyers for Rodrigo Duterte, well, not the lawyer, but his spokesperson, who is in The Hague, and some of you have heard of him, of course. He was also a classmate of mine, Harry Roque. So he was one of my closest friends in law school. And so, you know, it's important to not rely on the ICC case as a case for memorialization or even truth-seeking. You will only have a small number of witnesses. These witnesses will testify to incidents. There might be contextual witnesses to testify to the drug war, but at the same time, they won't testify to why poor people in the Philippines resort to drugs, for example. That's not going to be litigated at the ICC. But that's an important question when we want to convince other Filipinos that the drug war was wrong. Right? So that's why it's not enough to prosecute. It's just as important to do truth-seeking, to memorialize, which brings us to young people who have no idea what we're talking about. But they have anime. I've watched anime with my kids. They're college kids, but they grew up on anime. And, you know, in a way, you could say they reflect what zeitgeist, the cultural moment is about. But then One Piece came out in the 90s. So you also wonder, right? Wait, how come this anime from the 1990s, am I correct? Right? Is now the flag of these protests in the 2020s. And so I think it's not that these are captured in anime, but that young people, when they protest, identify with characters, with individuals, with people who may represent what they want to happen next. And I think it's important to introduce a cultural perspective to transitional justice that considers what young people listen to, watch, read. In the Gambia, where we have work, we organize hip-hop festivals to talk about transitional justice. In Colombia, there are days of dancing where they also discuss reparations. And so I think whether it's generations or families that are older who survive, this question of should we burn down society or should we reform it, I think is an eternal question. I wasn't around yet, but I'm sure when Nero was playing his violin and Rome was burning, they also asked that question, like, maybe we shouldn't have done that, or maybe we should have. I think that this also really challenges you to think about the ideological premises of justice, including transitional justice. When the Arab Spring happened, you know, one question was, are we revolting against Ben Ali because he was a dictator, or are we revolting against the policies of Ben Ali's dictatorship? Right? Because that question brings you to two trajectories. We get rid of Ben Ali, send him to prison, or he goes into exile in Saudi Arabia and then he dies. Is that justice? Or Ben Ali is gone, but we still have these policies adopted by the new Tunisian government, prescribed by the World Bank, relied on by France, and we go play the same
Right, and
game
it's also
again.
colonial legacies.
So I think these ideological questions are important to ask. And if you see a manga or an anime that talks about it, let me know.
Thank you. I'm just checking the time here. If I can just jump in very quickly, when I asked to see you in New York 2 years ago now, October 2023, because I wanted to interview you for my current book, you somehow managed to get me to speak to your colleagues about transitional justice in Palestine. And at the time, this was October 2023, the first thing that came to my mind was the right to self-determination and how surprisingly silent transitional justice is on this issue. And you had mentioned the Bangsamoro earlier, but also sort of more broadly, do you have any quick thoughts about transitional justice and the right to self-determination?
You should invite me to Georgetown again. No, but maybe just a shorter, semi-longer answer. Transitional justice literature, if you go to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website, they have links to transitional justice materials. But you will always see that some of the earliest materials are about reports from the Special Rapporteur on remedies for civil and political rights violations. That Special Rapporteur, Louis Junet, French jurist, was tasked by the United Nations in a long time ago, to produce that report. And his report says basically, it's one of the foundations of transitional justice. He says truth commissions, prosecutions, reparations are important as remedies for civil and political rights violations, for torture, murder, or even rape and disappearances. Right? And that's fine. And so you will have literature now echoing that. Many of the books that you might read, chapters, articles about transitional justice, sometimes go back to it's now called the Junet principles. It wasn't just Louis Junet who was appointed by the United Nations as a special rapporteur on human rights. There was a Senegalese jurist, and do you remember his name?
No.
I should, but now suddenly after talking about him, I forget his name. A Senegalese jurist was simultaneously appointed to come up with a report on remedies for violations of economic and social rights. His report came out alongside Junet, but you don't hear about his report. You don't hear his name. I can't even remember his name right now. And that's what has happened to transitional justice. It has excluded what the Arab Spring wanted included. Grievances about corruption, grievances about marginalization, karama for the Arabic speakers, dignity. That's not a legal concept. It's a concept we know. You don't have to be a lawyer to know. Excluded by transitional justice as it evolved. And I have had to fight alongside Noha for the inclusion of these concepts. And so alongside that are concepts like self-determination. The idea that there is a right to self-determination, and now it's in the UN General Assembly resolution, the right to use whatever methods in order to liberate yourself. It's actually a right, technically, and a lawyer can speak to that right. And yet, that has been lost in the discourse around not just Palestine, but many liberation movements. In fact, there was a time when the idea of a national liberation movement was a legal concept, NLM. There was a time when the idea of self-determination was way up there in the hierarchy of international law. So what does that tell us? It tells us that international law is not static. It also tells us that international law does not necessarily always move forward. It could move backward. It tells us that law is not as important as justice. And so that's what I always say when I do this thing.
Yeah.
We are not here to talk about law, we are here to talk about justice. And sometimes law gets in the way of justice.
Ruben, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Let's give Ruben a round of applause. I know that there were more questions, but we do have a reception happening outside right now where you can mingle. And also, since I know there are a lot of students here, there's the Filipino Student Club event tomorrow with Ruben at 2 o'clock in room 0804, thank you. And there will be posters everywhere. So if you are a student who will be around tomorrow, please join them for this discussion. And really, thank you for all your fascinating remarks and highlighting all the ironies and sharing some of the fascinating stories. And I hope it doesn't take me another 10 years to bring you back to Doha. Thank you, everyone.